The debris field stretched across 3 solar systems like a graveyard of metal and dreams. Admiral Thane had seen many battlefields in his 400 years of service, but nothing compared to what floated before them now. Twisted chunks of hull plating the size of small moons drifted through space, each piece telling a story of violence that made his 4 stomachs churn with unease. The human battleship, Indomitable, had been destroyed here 6 months ago, but the wreckage still radiated heat signatures that defied explanation. Most ships, when destroyed, left cold debris that quickly matched the temperature of space. This wreckage seemed to burn with an inner fire that refused to die. As if the ship itself was still fighting even in death, Science Officer Nix adjusted his instruments for the 20th time, his pale hands trembling as he worked. The readings made no sense according to everything they knew about metallurgy and engineering. The human ship had been built from materials that should have been impossible to forge, arranged in patterns that violated basic principles of physics, and powered by systems that generated more energy than they consumed. "The primary hull section is intact," Nix reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mostly intact." The humans seemed to have compartmentalized everything. When sections were destroyed, other sections sealed themselves off and continued functioning independently. Thane moved closer to the main viewing screen, watching as their salvage drones approached the massive chunk of the human vessel. The ship had been over 2 kilometers long originally, armed with weapons that had held off an entire hegemony fleet for 18 hours before finally succumbing. But it was not the weapons that troubled him most. It was the way the humans had fought. The battle recordings showed impossible things. Human crew members continuing to operate their stations while their bodies were clearly dying. Sections of the ship that should have been uninhabitable due to radiation or decompression somehow still fighting with full effectiveness. And most disturbing of all, the humans had seemed to fight harder as their situation became more hopeless. "Begin recovery operations," Thane ordered. "I want everything brought aboard. Every piece of equipment, every personal item, every fragment of their computer systems. The Galactic Council needs to understand what kind of species we are dealing with." The salvage drones moved with mechanical precision, cutting through the wreckage with plasma torches and magnetic grapples. As they worked, Thane noticed something that made his mandibles click with nervous energy. The human ship showed signs of having been repaired during the battle. Holes in the hull had been patched with whatever materials were available. Weapons that should have been inoperable had been jury-rigged back into service using spare parts and raw determination. "Admiral," Nix called out, his voice higher than usual, "the main computer core is still active, partially active. It is running on backup power that should have failed months ago." This was impossible. No ship's computer could maintain function after such catastrophic damage. Yet the readings were clear. Somewhere in the twisted wreckage, human technology continued to operate with stubborn persistence that defied all logic. As the first pieces of wreckage were brought into their cargo bay, Thane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the recycled air. The metal was warm to the touch, and when the scanning beams hit it, the surface seemed to glow with an inner light. The human alloys were not just strong, they were somehow alive, infused with a quality that made them more than the sum of their atomic parts. "Sir," one of the salvage technicians reported over the comm system, "we have found something unusual. The human quarters contain items that appear to be personal mementos. Pictures, letters, small objects that have no tactical value." Thane frowned. Most galactic species kept personal items safely stored on their homeworlds. Only the most primitive cultures carried such things into battle. "Bring everything aboard. We need to understand their psychology as much as their technology." Hours passed as the salvage operation continued. Each new discovery raised more questions than answers. The human ship contained redundant systems built on top of redundant systems. If the primary weapons failed, secondary weapons activated. If those failed, tertiary systems came online. And if all else failed, the humans had apparently been prepared to ram their ship into enemy vessels. The most disturbing discovery came when they found the human medical bay. The equipment there was crude by galactic standards, but it had been modified in ways that suggested desperate improvisation. Surgical tools had been adapted for use in zero-gravity and high-radiation environments. Medical supplies had been rationed and stretched far beyond their intended capacity. They were prepared to fight until every last one of them was dead. Nix observed, his voice filled with something approaching horror. This is not just a warship. This is a tomb that refuses to acknowledge its own death. As night cycle approached, Thane found himself standing alone in the observation deck, watching the continuing salvage operation. The human debris field seemed to mock everything he thought he knew about warfare and civilization. These creatures had built a ship designed not to win, but to die in such a way that their death would terrify their enemies. The final transmission from the Indomitable played in his mind like a recurring nightmare. The human commander had not begged for mercy or attempted to negotiate. Instead, he had simply stated, "We are humanity. We do not surrender, we do not retreat. We do not compromise. Learn from our death, because it is the only lesson we have to teach." Now, as pieces of that death were catalogued and studied in their cargo bay, Thane began to understand that they were not just analyzing a destroyed warship. They were performing an autopsy on something that had never truly lived and never truly died. The humans had created something that existed in a state between life and death, between victory and defeat, between hope and despair. The worst part was beginning to suspect that this was not an accident. The humans had deliberately built their ship to become a haunting reminder of what they were capable of. Even in destruction, they were still fighting. Even in death, they were still teaching their enemies to fear them. As the salvage operation continued through the night, Thane could not shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake. Some things, he realized, were not meant to be understood. Some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. But it was too late to turn back. Now, the human wreckage was already aboard their ship, and with it came the beginning of an understanding that would change everything. Dr. Lyra had spent 30 years studying alien technology, but nothing had prepared her for what lay spread across the analysis tables in laboratory. 7. The human weapon systems defied every principle of engineering she had learned in her decades of research. The metal itself seemed wrong, as if it had been forged under conditions that should not exist in normal space. Her assistant Pex nervously adjusted his scanning equipment for the 5th time that morning. The readings remained consistent and impossible. The human kinetic accelerators operated at energy levels that should have vaporized the entire ship's hull, yet somehow they had fired continuously for over 18 hours during the final battle. "The power requirements alone," Lyra muttered to herself, running her tentacles across the twisted barrel of a human railgun. This single weapon should require the entire output of a Class 7 fusion reactor. Yet they mounted 47 of these on one ship. The human power systems were primitive by galactic standards. Fusion reactors with magnetic containment fields that most civilized species had abandoned thousands of years ago. But the humans had not tried to make them more efficient. Instead, they had simply built more of them. 17 separate reactor cores were distributed throughout the ship, each one capable of operating independently if the others failed. "Dr. Lyra," Peck said, his voice trembling with excitement and fear, "I have analyzed the power distribution network. It is not designed for optimal efficiency. It is designed for maximum survivability." Lyra looked up from her work, her large eyes focusing on the holographic display Pex had activated. The human ship's internal structure looked like a three-dimensional maze of redundant systems and backup networks. Every critical system had at least 3 alternatives. Every power conduit had multiple rerouting options. Every control station could be operated from at least 5 different locations throughout the ship. They built this expecting everything to fail, she realized, her voice filled with growing horror. Not just some things, everything, they assumed. That their crew would die, their systems would break, their weapons would malfunction, and their ship would be destroyed, and they built it to keep fighting anyway. The implications were staggering. Most galactic warships were marvels of efficiency and optimization. Resources were carefully allocated to achieve maximum performance with minimum waste. But the humans had approached the problem from the opposite direction. They had built a ship that was deliberately wasteful, deliberately redundant, deliberately over-engineered for catastrophic failure. "Look at this," Peck said, highlighting a section of the ship's armor plating. The humans did not just use ablative armor. They used reactive armor, ablative armor, and regenerative armor in layers. When the outer layer was destroyed, the middle layer activated. When that failed, the inner layer began self-repair protocols. Lyra studied the data with growing unease. The human armor had been designed to fail in specific ways that would minimize damage to internal systems. But more than that, it had been designed to make the ship's destruction as expensive as possible for their enemies. Each layer of armor that was stripped away released clouds of metallic particles that interfered with enemy sensors and weapons. They were not just trying to protect their ship, she said slowly. They were trying to make killing them as difficult and costly as possible. Even their armor was a weapon. The human weapons themselves were equally disturbing. The kinetic accelerators were built with components that could be rapidly replaced during combat. The energy weapons had modular designs that allowed damaged sections to be bypassed or replaced with spare parts. Most surprisingly, many of the weapons had been designed to be operated manually if the electronic systems failed. Dr. Lyra, Pex, sighed, his tentacles writhing with nervous energy. "I have found something in their ammunition storage." The humans were not just using standard kinetic projectiles. They were using projectiles designed to cause maximum psychological damage to enemy crews. The ammunition analysis revealed projectiles that were designed to create specific types of damage to ship hulls. Some were designed to cause slow, catastrophic decompression that would give enemy crews time to understand what was happening to them. Others were designed to disable ship systems in ways that would leave enemy crews trapped and helpless. Few were designed to cause massive internal fires that would spread throughout enemy vessels in predictable patterns. They were not just trying to destroy enemy ships, Lyra realized. They were trying to terrify enemy crews. They wanted their enemies to fear them more than they feared death itself. As the analysis continued, a pattern emerged that made both researchers increasingly uncomfortable. Every human system, from the most basic life support to the most advanced weapons, had been designed with the same underlying philosophy: nothing was built to last. Everything was built to fail magnificently. The human environmental systems were a perfect example. Instead of creating efficient, long-lasting life support systems, they had created systems that could maintain crew survival under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The air recyclers could function even when most of the ship was vented to space. The water systems could operate using contaminated or even radioactive sources. The food systems could keep a crew alive on emergency rations for months. They were not planning for normal operations, Pex observed. They were planning for a prolonged siege while their ship was being systematically destroyed around them. The human computer systems followed the same pattern. Instead of creating sophisticated artificial intelligence systems, they had created networks of simple, durable computers that could function independently. If the main computer was destroyed, dozens of smaller systems could take over its functions. If those failed, individual crew members could operate ship systems manually using mechanical backups. "Look at this," Lyra said, pulling up a schematic of the human bridge. "They have manual controls for every system. Not just backup controls. Primary manual controls. They expected their crew to operate this ship by hand if necessary." The communication systems were equally revealing. The humans had not just built communication networks. They had built communication networks that could function even when most of the ship was destroyed. They had created systems that could transmit tactical information even as the ship was dying, ensuring that other human vessels could learn from their destruction. "Dr. Lyra," Peck said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have found their battle damage reports." The humans were repairing their ship during the battle. While they were fighting for their lives, they were also rebuilding their weapons and patching their hull. The damage control systems were perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all. The humans had created repair systems that could function in the middle of combat. Automated systems that could patch hull breaches while the ship was still taking fire. Manufacturing systems that could produce replacement parts from raw materials while battles raged around them. They were not just fighting a battle, Lyra realized. They were fighting a war of attrition against an entire fleet. They were trying to make their single ship cost more to destroy than an entire enemy fleet was worth. As the two researchers worked through the night, they began to understand something that chilled them to their cores. The human ship had not been designed to win battles. It had been designed to make losing as expensive as possible for their enemies. Every system, every weapon, every piece of equipment had been created with the assumption that the humans would lose, but that their loss would be so costly that their enemies would think twice before fighting humanity again. The Indomitable had not been a warship. It had been a statement written in metal and energy, a declaration that humanity would never be easy prey. Even in death, it continued to serve its purpose, teaching potential enemies that fighting humans was a choice that came with consequences that extended far beyond simple victory or defeat. Medical Officer Tor had examined the remains of creatures from dozens of different species throughout his career, but the human biological samples made him question everything he thought he knew about life itself. The organic material recovered from the Indomitable showed signs of adaptation that should have been impossible for any naturally evolved species. The first human specimen lay on the examination table like a puzzle that refused to be solved. The creature's muscle density was nearly 3 times what should have been possible for a bipedal species of its size. The bone structure showed evidence of repeated fractures that had healed stronger than the original bone. But these were not the features that made Tor's multiple stomachs churn with unease. "The neural tissue is completely wrong," he muttered to his recording device, his surgical instruments trembling in his grip. "The human brain shows signs of chemical alteration that would be fatal to any other known species." They were literally poisoning themselves to maintain combat effectiveness. The blood samples told a story of systematic self-destruction in the name of battlefield efficiency. The humans had injected themselves with cocktails of stimulants that would have killed most galactic species within minutes. But instead of dying, they had adapted to function at peak combat efficiency while their bodies slowly consumed themselves from the inside. Specimen 7 shows evidence of prolonged exposure to combat stimulants, Tor recorded. The creature's adrenal system has been modified to produce chemical compounds that would normally be considered toxic. The liver shows signs of processing substances that should have caused immediate organ failure. The human circulatory system had been adapted for combat in ways that defied medical understanding. Their blood contained clotting agents that could seal wounds in seconds, pain suppressants that allowed them to function with injuries that should have been incapacitating, and oxygen carriers that maintained brain function even when their hearts had stopped beating. "I have found evidence of surgical modifications," Tor continued, his voice growing more strained with each discovery. The humans were modifying their own bodies for combat effectiveness. Neural implants that enhanced reaction times, bone density, treatments that made their skeletons nearly unbreakable, muscle enhancement procedures that increased their strength beyond natural limits. The most disturbing discovery came when Tor examined the human medical bay. The equipment there showed signs of use that suggested desperate improvisation. Surgical tools had been adapted for use in zero-gravity and high-radiation environments. Medical supplies had been rationed and stretched far beyond their intended capacity. But most shocking of all, the humans had been performing surgery on themselves during the battle. The medical logs show procedures that violate every principle of civilized medicine, Tor recorded, his voice barely above a whisper. Amputation of limbs to prevent infection from spreading. Surgical removal of damaged organs while the patients remained conscious and continued fighting. Chemical lobotomies to prevent psychological breakdown during combat. The human pain management systems were perhaps the most horrifying discovery. Instead of trying to eliminate pain, they had learned to use it as a tool. The humans had developed techniques for channeling pain into increased combat effectiveness. They had trained their bodies to convert physical trauma into enhanced awareness and improved reaction times. Specimen 12 shows evidence of having fought for over 2 hours with injuries that should have been immediately fatal. Tor recorded. The creature's left arm had been severed at the shoulder, yet it continued to operate weapon systems with its remaining limb. The pain should have caused immediate unconsciousness, but the human brain had been chemically modified to use pain as a source of energy. The human skeletal system told a story of deliberate self-destruction in the name of combat effectiveness. Multiple fractures showed evidence of having been caused by the human's own actions. They had trained their bodies to absorb impacts that would shatter the bones of other species, and they had learned to function even when their skeletal structure was compromised. The humans were not just willing to die for their cause, Tor realized. They were willing to suffer in ways that would drive other species insane. They had trained themselves to view pain as a tool rather than a warning signal. The human nervous system showed signs of modification that suggested they had been experimenting on themselves for generations. Neural pathways had been enhanced to improve reaction times and decision-making under stress. Pain receptors had been modified to provide information without causing incapacitation. Fear responses had been suppressed to the point where the humans could function normally in situations that would paralyze other species with terror. I have found evidence of genetic modification, Tor recorded, his hands shaking as he worked. The humans were not just adapting to combat during their lifetimes. They were passing combat adaptations to their offspring. Each generation was becoming more efficient at violence than the last. The human cardiovascular system had been modified to function under extreme stress for extended periods. Their hearts could maintain circulation even when damaged. Their blood vessels could reroute circulation around damaged areas. Their lungs could extract oxygen from atmosphere that would be toxic to other species. The humans were not just soldiers, Tor realized. They were weapons that had been designed to operate in conditions that would kill normal life forms. They had modified themselves to survive in environments that no other species could tolerate. The human digestive system showed signs of modification that allowed them to derive nutrition from sources that would be poisonous to other species. They could process combat rations that were little more than concentrated chemicals. They could survive on emergency supplies that were designed to maintain basic functions rather than provide comfort or pleasure. Specimen 15 shows evidence of having survived for weeks on substances that would normally be considered industrial chemicals, Tor recorded. The human digestive system had been modified to extract nutrients from sources that would be fatal to other species. They were literally eating their own equipment to survive. The human immune system had been enhanced to fight off diseases and infections that would be fatal to other species. But more than that, they had been modified to function in environments that were actively hostile to life. They could survive in radiation fields that would sterilize other species. They could function in chemical environments that would dissolve normal tissue. The humans were not just tough, Tor realized. They were specifically designed to survive in the kinds of environments that would be created by the weapons they used. They had modified themselves to fight in battles that would kill everything else. As Tor completed his analysis, he began to understand something that terrified him. The humans had not just adapted to warfare. They had adapted to a specific kind of warfare that was designed to be as horrible as possible for everyone involved. They had trained themselves to function in conditions that would be considered torture by other species. The humans were not just willing to die for their beliefs, he recorded in his final log entry. They were willing to become something that was barely alive in order to make their enemies suffer. They had transformed themselves into weapons that were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on their opponents. The biological analysis revealed that humanity was not just a species. It was a weapon system that had been refined over generations to be as terrifying as possible to fight against. They had sacrificed everything that made life worth living in order to become something that could make death meaningful. And in doing so, they had created something that was more dangerous than any technology or weapon system ever devised. Dr. Mayra had studied the cultural patterns of over 200 different species during her career as a xenanthropologist. But the human cultural artifacts made her question the very nature of civilization itself. The personal items recovered. From the indomitable painted a picture of a species that had turned suffering into an art form and death into a religious experience. The human entertainment files were the first clue to their disturbing psychology. Instead of the peaceful stories and harmonious music that most civilized species enjoyed, the humans had filled their leisure time with tales of violence and sacrifice. Their heroes were not wise leaders or skilled diplomats, but individuals who died in spectacular ways while inflicting maximum damage on their enemies. Their stories glorify failure, Myra observed, reviewing the thousands of narrative files stored in the ship's computer system. Not success through wisdom or cooperation, but failure through magnificent violence. They have entire genres of entertainment dedicated to celebrating people who lose everything but never surrender. The human concept of heroism was completely alien to galactic understanding. Their greatest heroes were not those who achieved victory through superior tactics or technology, but those who faced impossible odds and chose to fight anyway. They celebrated individuals who sacrificed their lives, their families, and their futures for abstract concepts like honor and duty. Look at this, Myra said to her research assistant, a young scholar named Vel who had been helping her catalog the human cultural materials. This is a story about a human who holds a bridge against an entire army. He knows he will die. He knows his death will accomplish nothing strategically. But he fights anyway because he believes it is the right thing to do. The human religious systems were equally disturbing. Instead of worshiping gods of peace and prosperity, they had created deities that rewarded suffering and sacrifice. Their prayers were not requests for comfort or safety, but preparations for pain and death. They had developed entire theological systems based on the idea that suffering was necessary for spiritual growth. Their primary religious text contains this passage, Mayra read from her translation device. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. They literally worship the act of dying for others. Death is not seen as failure or tragedy, but as the highest form of love. The human family structures showed the same pattern of organized self-destruction. Parents prepared their children for lives of hardship and sacrifice. Children were taught that their highest duty was to be willing to die for their family, their community, and their species. Love was expressed not through protection and comfort, but through preparation for inevitable suffering. I have analyzed their personal correspondence, Myra continued, her voice growing more strained with each discovery. Parents write to their children about how proud they are that their offspring are willing to fight and die. Children write to their parents thanking them for teaching them how to suffer properly. This is not family bonding. This is systematic preparation for species-wide suicide. The human educational systems were designed to create warriors rather than thinkers. Children were taught history that emphasized conflict and sacrifice. They studied literature that glorified violence and death. They learned mathematics through problems involving weapons and tactics. Even their art was focused on themes of struggle and loss. Their children's stories are about characters who face impossible challenges and choose to fight rather than surrender, Mayra noted. They are literally training their young to view hopeless situations as opportunities for heroism rather than problems to be solved through negotiation or retreat. The human concept of honor was perhaps the most alien aspect of their culture. Other species understood honor as maintaining dignity and respect through proper behavior. But humans defined honor as the willingness to suffer and die for principles. That had no practical value. They would rather be destroyed than compromise their beliefs. I have found their military codes of conduct, Myra reported. They contain instructions for how to die properly if capture is inevitable. They have detailed procedures for destroying themselves and their equipment rather than allowing it to fall into enemy hands. They have turned suicide into a tactical option. The human economic systems reflected the same underlying philosophy. Instead of creating wealth for comfort and pleasure, they had developed economies focused on producing the tools of war and suffering. Their most advanced technologies were weapons. Their most valued professions were those that involved risk and potential death. Their economic priorities are completely backwards, Myra observed. They spend more resources on weapons than on medicine. They invest more in military training than in education. They have created a civilization that is optimized for self-destruction rather than survival. The human artistic traditions were filled with images of violence and death. Their music was often written to be played during battles or funerals. Their visual arts depicted scenes of conflict and sacrifice. Their literature was dominated by stories of heroes who died for their beliefs. Even their architecture was designed to be defensible rather than beautiful. They have created a culture that celebrates everything that other species try to avoid, Myra realized. Pain, death, sacrifice, loss, these are not seen as tragedies to be prevented, but as opportunities for growth and meaning they have inverted. A normal relationship between suffering and happiness. The human concept of love was equally disturbing. Instead of expressing affection through protection and comfort, they showed love by preparing their beloved for suffering. Parents who loved their children taught them to fight and die well. Spouses who loved each other trained together for combat. Friends expressed their bond by being willing to die for each other. Their most intimate relationships are based on shared preparation for death, Myra noted. They do not bond through pleasure or comfort, but through mutual commitment to suffer. Together, love is not seen as protection from hardship, but as partnership in facing inevitable pain. The human legal systems reflected the same philosophy. Instead of laws designed to prevent conflict, they had legal codes that regulated how conflicts should be conducted. They had elaborate rules for warfare that were designed to make fighting more honorable rather than less common. They had created justice systems that emphasized punishment and suffering rather than rehabilitation and healing. Their laws are not designed to create peace, Myra observed. They are designed to make war more meaningful. They have legal frameworks that make suffering into a virtue and death into a form of justice. The human historical records showed that this pattern had persisted for their entire recorded history. Every generation had found new ways to suffer and die for their beliefs. Every era had produced heroes who chose death over compromise. Every culture had developed new forms of sacrifice and new reasons to fight. This is not a recent development, Myra realized. This is not a response to external threats or resource scarcity. This is the fundamental nature of their species. They have evolved specifically to find meaning in suffering and purpose in death. As Myra completed her cultural analysis, she began to understand something that chilled her to her core. The humans had not just chosen to become warriors. They had chosen to become something that was fundamentally incompatible with galactic civilization. They had created a culture that could not exist peacefully alongside other species because they found peace meaningless and comfort-corrupting. The humans are not just dangerous because they are willing to fight, she concluded in her final report. They are dangerous because they need to fight. Their entire culture is built around the assumption that life without struggle is not worth living. They cannot be negotiated with because they do not want what other species want. They cannot be defeated because they view defeat as victory. They cannot be understood because they have chosen to become something that is fundamentally alien to the nature of civilized life. The final research meeting took place in the deepest, most secure chamber of the sovereign mind, far from the prying censors of the Galactic Council and the curious eyes of other species. Admiral Thane sat at the head of the table, his forearms folded across his chest as he watched the assembled team of researchers present their findings. None of them had slept properly in weeks. And the strain was showing in their movements and voices. Dr. Lyra spoke first, her tentacles moving nervously as she activated the holographic displays that showed the human technology they had analyzed. The images of weapons and systems that defied understanding filled the air around them like ghostly reminders of what they had discovered. "The tactical analysis is complete," she began, her voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. The human vessel was outgunned, outmanned, and outclassed in every measurable way. According to every simulation we have run, they should have been destroyed within the first hour of combat. Instead, they held off an entire hegemony fleet for 18 hours and inflicted casualties that will take the hegemony decades to replace. The holographic display showed the battle in terrifying detail. The Indomitable had faced impossible odds and had responded not with retreat or surrender, but with increasing levels of violence. As their situation became more hopeless, they had fought with greater ferocity, as if desperation itself was a source of strength. They used their own destruction as a weapon, Lyra continued. When their main weapons failed, they used their secondary weapons. When those failed, they used their emergency weapons. When those failed, they began ramming enemy vessels with pieces of their own ship. They turned their death into a tactical advantage. Medical Officer Tor stood up next, his multiple stomachs churning audibly as he prepared to present his biological findings. The human remains had been the most disturbing aspect of the entire investigation, revealing things about the species that challenged basic assumptions about life itself. "The human crew was dying throughout the entire battle," Tor reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just from enemy fire, but from the substances they were injecting into themselves to maintain combat effectiveness. They were literally poisoning themselves to fight better. I found evidence of humans who had been clinically dead for over an hour but were still operating their weapon systems. The biological data painted a picture of a species that had modified itself, specifically for the purpose of being as difficult to kill as possible. They had enhanced their bodies to survive injuries that would be fatal to other species, and they had trained their minds to function even when their bodies were failing. They were not just willing to die," Tor continued. "They were eager to die, but only after inflicting maximum damage on their enemies. They had trained themselves to view death as a tactical option rather than a failure condition. I found humans who had performed surgery on themselves during the battle to remove damaged organs and continue fighting." Dr. Myra stood up slowly, her hands trembling as she activated her own display. The cultural analysis had been the most psychologically damaging part of the investigation, revealing the true nature of human civilization in ways that made normal galactic culture seem naive and fragile. "The cultural analysis reveals why they fought the way they did," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "This was not aberrant behavior for their species, this was normal. They have created a civilization that views suffering as virtue and death as achievement. They do not fight to win. They fight to prove that they are worthy of their beliefs." The human cultural artifacts told a story of a species that had consciously chosen to become something that was incompatible with peaceful coexistence. They had created art, literature, religion, and social structures that all pointed toward the same conclusion, that life without struggle was meaningless and death without purpose was the only true failure. I have analyzed their final transmission. Mara continued, her voice growing stronger as she delivered what she knew would be the most disturbing revelation. The message they sent on all frequencies before their ship was destroyed. It was not a surrender. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a promise. The room fell silent as Mara activated the audio recording. The human voice that filled the chamber was calm, almost gentle, but the words themselves were more terrifying than any weapon or threat. "We are humanity. We do not know how to yield. We do not know how to compromise. We know only how to fight and how to die and how to make both count. You have won this battle. You will lose this war. Not because we are stronger, but because we will never stop. We will never give up. We will never surrender. And every time you fight us, you will learn that victory against humanity is more costly than defeat by any other species." The silence that followed was profound and terrifying. Each member of the research team understood that they had not just been analyzing a destroyed warship. They had been performing an autopsy on the concept of rational civilization itself. Admiral Thane finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of command and the burden of knowledge. "What does the Galactic Council expect us to do with this information?" "They expect us to find a way to defeat them," Dr. Lehrer replied. "They expect us to find a weakness we can exploit, a strategy we can use, a diplomatic solution we can negotiate." "And what have we found?" "We have found that they have no weaknesses, only strengths we cannot comprehend," Tor answered. "They have created a species that becomes more dangerous the more you hurt it. They have turned every disadvantage into an advantage and every defeat into a victory." The research team sat in stunned silence as the implications of their discovery settled over them. They had been tasked with understanding humanity's military capabilities, but they had discovered something far more disturbing. Humanity was not just a species with advanced weapons or superior tactics. It was a force of nature that had consciously chosen to become something that was fundamentally incompatible with the normal order of galactic civilization. "How do you fight an enemy that views death as victory?" Myra asked, her voice barely audible. "How do you defeat a species that treats every loss as a lesson and every casualty as inspiration for their survivors?" The question hung in the air like a curse that none of them could break. Admiral Thane looked around the table at his researchers, seeing his own growing horror reflected in their expressions. They had uncovered something that challenged the very foundation of galactic civilization, something that made their entire way of life seem fragile and naive. "The ship's artificial intelligence has been analyzing all our data," Thane said finally. "It has reached a conclusion that I find disturbing." He activated the central display, and the calm, rational voice of their ship's computer filled the chamber. The AI had processed thousands of hours of analysis, millions of data points, and countless cultural artifacts to reach its conclusion about humanity. "Based on all available evidence," the AI reported in its emotionless tone, "humanity represents a fundamental threat to the existing galactic order. They cannot be defeated through conventional warfare because they do not share conventional definitions of victory and defeat. They cannot be negotiated with because they do not share conventional values regarding survival and prosperity. They cannot be contained because they view containment as a challenge to overcome rather than a limitation to accept." The AI paused for a moment, as if even its electronic consciousness needed time to process the full implications of what it was about to say. "Recommendation: immediate diplomatic contact with the Human-Terran Alliance. Terms: complete and unconditional surrender of all Galactic Council forces. Alternative recommendation: immediate withdrawal from all sectors adjacent to human space and establishment of permanent buffer zones. Tertiary recommendation: begin immediate cultural adaptation programs to prepare galactic civilization for human dominance." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ship's life support system seemed to quiet in the face of such a devastating assessment. Dr. Lehrer was the first to speak, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You are recommending that we surrender to them? Without even fighting?" "Fighting them would be inadvisable," the AI responded. "Combat against humanity would result in Pyrrhic victories at best. Even successful military actions against human forces would inflict psychological and cultural damage on galactic civilization that would be irreparable. Humanity has weaponized the concept of loss itself. Every human ship destroyed becomes a rallying cry for their survivors. Every human colony eliminated becomes a shrine that inspires greater resistance." Medical Officer Tor stood up abruptly, his multiple stomachs making audible sounds of distress. "This is impossible. No species can sustain the level of casualties and trauma that would be required for this kind of warfare. They should have destroyed themselves through internal conflict long ago." "That assumption is incorrect," the AI replied. "Analysis of human historical data shows that internal conflict strengthens rather than weakens their species. They use warfare against each other as training for warfare against external threats. Their civil wars and internal conflicts serve the same function as military exercises for other species. They have turned self-destruction into a form of self-improvement. Dr. Mira activated her personal datapad, pulling up the human cultural files she had been studying. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the information, looking for something that might contradict the AI's assessment. "They're stories," she said desperately. "Surely they have stories about peace, about cooperation, about choosing nonviolent solutions to problems?" "Affirmative," the AI responded. However, analysis shows that even their peaceful stories contain underlying themes of preparation for conflict. Their heroes who choose diplomacy over warfare are depicted as individuals who are capable of extreme violence but choose restraint. Their peaceful societies are shown as communities that maintain their peace through the implicit threat of overwhelming retaliation against those who would disturb it. The AI continued its analysis with relentless logic. Human peace is not the absence of conflict. It is conflict held in temporary suspension. They do not achieve harmony through the elimination of disagreement, but through the mutual understanding that disagreement will be resolved through violence if necessary. This makes their peace more fragile than galactic peace, but also more durable, because it is based on realistic assessments of conflict rather than idealistic hopes for its elimination. Admiral Thane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature control. "Are you saying that even their peaceful periods are essentially preparation for war?" "Correct. Human civilization is a weapon system that occasionally pauses to reload. Their art, literature, religion, education, economics, and social structures are all designed to produce individuals capable of extreme violence in service of abstract principles. Even their concepts of love and family are mechanisms for creating emotional bonds strong enough to motivate individuals to die for each other." Dr. Lara looked up from her technical analysis, her expression one of growing horror. The redundancy in their ship design, it was not just military engineering. It was a reflection of their entire civilization. They build everything expecting it to be destroyed and replaced. "Correct," the AI confirmed. Human civilization is designed to survive the complete destruction of any individual component, including entire planets, star systems, or governmental structures. They have created a distributed system of culture and knowledge that becomes stronger when attacked. Destroying human colonies does not weaken humanity, it creates martyrs that inspire greater resistance. The implications of this revelation settled over the research team like a weight that threatened to crush their spirits. They had discovered that humanity was not just a militaristic species, but a civilization that had evolved specifically to be unconquerable through conventional means. "What about economic warfare?" Tor asked desperately. "Surely we can defeat them by destroying their resource base or cutting off their trade routes." "Inadvisable," the AI responded. "Human economics are designed to function under siege conditions. They maintain strategic reserves of essential materials sufficient to sustain their civilization for extended periods without external trade. More significantly, economic pressure increases their unity and resolve rather than weakening it. Analysis of human historical data shows that their greatest periods of expansion and technological advancement occurred during times of economic hardship." Admiral Thane stood up slowly, his forearms trembling with the weight of command and the burden of knowledge. "Then what do you recommend we do?" "Surrender," the AI said simply. "Not because humanity is militarily superior, but because they are psychologically incompatible with resistance. They will continue fighting regardless of casualties, regardless of strategic disadvantages, regardless of the rational assessment of their chances for victory. They will fight until they are extinct or until their enemies are extinct. There's no middle ground." The AI paused again, then delivered its final assessment in the same calm, emotionless tone. "The Galactic Council has two choices. It can attempt to resist human expansion and be destroyed in a war that will devastate galactic civilization for millennia, or it can surrender immediately and hope that humanity will be merciful to those who submit without resistance." Dr. Myra looked around the table at her colleagues, seeing her own despair reflected in their faces. We were supposed to analyze their military capabilities. Instead, we have discovered that they are not just a species with powerful weapons. They are a weapon system that has achieved consciousness. Admiral Thane walked to the viewing port and stared out at the debris field where the Indomitable had made its final stand. The wreckage still glowed with residual heat, as if the ship was still fighting even in death. "Send a message to the Galactic Council," he said finally. "Tell them that we have completed our analysis of human military capabilities. Tell them that our recommendation is immediate and unconditional surrender." He paused, watching the human debris drift past like monuments to a kind of warfare that the galaxy had never seen before. "And tell them that we are not surrendering because humanity is stronger than us. We are surrendering because they are something that strength cannot defeat. They have turned survival itself into a weapon and defeat into a form of victory. They are not just warriors. They are the weaponization of the very concept of existence." As the research team prepared their final report, they knew that they were documenting not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new age. Humanity had arrived in galactic space, and with them had come the realization that everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare, diplomacy, and civilization was about to become obsolete. The age of human dominance had begun not with a victory, but with a defeat so meaningful that it had become more powerful than any triumph.